everybody. So many thanks to the Polyglot Conference for inviting me to share some of my experience of managing pan-European social media projects. I have not prepared any visuals, so just lean back and listen to some of my stories, which you will hopefully find interesting. And I'll start by introducing myself a bit first. I'm originally from Austria, but I have lived in the UK since 1999. And the majority of that time in Scotland. I also spent some time working and living in England. Since 2008, I have lived in the Northwest Highlands of Scotland, and I moved there 2 years after originally starting to work for the Social Element, which was then called eModeration. What had brought me into the line of online community management was starting and then running an online forum for British people who bought property in France, supporting them to navigate a new country, a new language and culture, and all the challenges that come with it. In parallel, I had supported social housing professionals in building support networks and online communities of practice. And these two strands of work led me to taking this up as a career, and it led to my current role as a senior project manager in social media. But before I tell you more about this work and both the challenges and rewards, let me take you all the way back to where my own journey of learning and using languages started. I learned English at school from the age of 10, which is probably in these days quite a late date or late age to start learning a language. And I learned French from the age of 14. For me, learning languages was always a ticket to the world to one day possibly study or work in another country. And once I went to university, I continued to use English in my studies and during travel, and it felt like it was growing with me, whereas my French was underused and slowly all my skills started to fade. If you had asked me when I was 20 if I would feel confident to apply for a job at a Scottish university when I was 27, competing with native speakers, I would have said probably not, because I was a very self-conscious user of foreign languages. I'm a bit of a perfectionist, so for me to speak or write English in the company of native speakers, especially in a professional setting, was always a bit awkward and not something I would seek out. But after my PhD, I got an opportunity to take part in a European project for young social scientists and to work at European universities for a while. And that meant that English truly became my working language. None of the others in this network were native speakers, but in order to collaborate with each other and with our host institutions, we simply used English. There was no concern over being perfect with regard to grammar or sentence constructions or always finding the right words. What mattered was having the opportunity to cross bridges and collaborate with each other. And in some cases, it was to get a real insight into social issues in the countries of our research. My own research was on single mothers in Norway, and I will be forever grateful to the women who were prepared to talk to me about very personal experiences in a second language. What I learned from this experience was that the best way to pay somebody back for the true effort of sharing their life and challenges in a foreign language is to be really appreciative in listening. So let's stick with the subject of having one language that connects people in their work. But let's jump forward all the way to my current role and the subject of this talk. I currently manage the teams that provide social media engagement, publishing, and social media customer service on two major pan-European clients. One includes more than 40 international consumer goods brands, and we service those brands in English, Italian, French, German, and Dutch. And the other one is 19 local markets for a high-profile e-commerce provider, which covers 17 languages. English is for us the language we use to communicate internally and to a large extent with our client contacts. The people who work with me are expected to be able to use English as their working language. We conduct training in English, and all our internal resources are also in English. The vast majority of our client contacts are also proficient in English, and yet we have over the years slightly changed our approach with regard to the extent we rely on English only. We have learned that we do lose context sometimes when we make our native speakers for example, a Dutch community manager, speak to a Dutch client contact in English about a problematic situation that has occurred on a social media platform. Even if the post in question would be shared in Dutch, describing the context of what happened, the reasoning behind the history and the dynamics, it's harder to summarize all of that in English compared to just providing us with a little snapshot of what happened in English and doing the rest in their native language. For quite some time before, we had insisted on English being used because those of us who do not speak Dutch would be left out. But over the years, we learned that letting native speakers discuss issues in their own language in detail and writing a shorter summary in English was much more efficient and constructive. I use Google Translate for many emails that our teams write to clients, and this gives me the basics. If necessary, I follow up for more details in English, and then we're all having the best of both worlds. It takes trust to use this approach, and it requires more targeted communication training for our team. But in my experience, it has paid off. Something else we have also become more aware is that the dynamics of a client conversation can sometimes be challenging when we don't factor in how comfortable or not a client is with English. Just because they are willing to communicate in English, often out of necessity, does not mean they find it easy. Speaking in your own language can be like a walk in a park. Communicating in a second language can be much more of an effort, and sometimes it can be a real uphill struggle. As an agency, we always prefer video meetings over purely written means of communication, like emails. But on my pan-European projects, the learning has been that to effectively discuss a topic, especially a technical one, or something really challenging, we need to realistically assess all our language abilities before deciding on the best approach. Sometimes it can be useful and easier for the client to share some information in writing beforehand, to give them a chance to prepare, and if needed, translate certain points from English to their language. They can also prepare their responses, and there's a much smaller risk that things literally get lost in translation. Even though it's good to meet and talk, sometimes when there are different levels of language proficiency, keeping things in writing can also be the best approach, because asking for clarification and explaining issues in more details can be more comfortable if we don't have to admit that we don't quite understand on a live call. I would advise anybody who has business relationships with people who don't always use English as their main language to simply be aware that if we see language as a tool, the tool needs adapting and fine-tuning. It's also very educational to put yourself in the shoes of people communicating in a second language. For some, that might just be when we go on holiday and try to talk in shops or restaurants. But if you speak a language you can use in a business context, occasionally at least, that is really good practice. After nearly 25 years of using English as my main language, my own sandbox is when I meet clients with whom I communicate in German. It remains my native language, but I have never worked in project management or social media in a German-speaking country. So my whole vocabulary in this area is English. Although I can figure out the right words and get the hang of German quite easily again, there is definitely, even for me, an element of discomfort when words don't come quickly or it's the wrong word that comes to mind first, and when you listen to yourself and just don't sound quite right. It's a humbling experience. And in my case, I always appreciate after that much more those who willingly communicate in English. Another angle worth considering is that if we communicate with non-native speakers, there's always something from their own language culture that may slip into their use of a working language like English. I have learned over the years that being more abrupt in English does not necessarily mean that somebody is meaning to be abrupt by the way they use English. Simply constructing short sentences or being quite curt might be mirroring how their own language works. As a native German speaker, it has taken me years and years to not construct overly complicated sentences with lots of subclauses. I was used to that style from my German academic work, and I had to really unlearn it. Sometimes I still fall into the habit, possibly even on this talk. Last but not least, on the subject of English as your working language, I often find that it can be hard to admit that things are not clear. It's understandable that we want to be polite and do not like to make somebody uncomfortable by asking for clarification or suggesting we don't understand. But it's a discomfort I think we should aim to push through. It gives people an opportunity to develop their skills, to improve and become more confident in a language. Hence, it is the kind and constructive thing to do, and it's not impolite at all. I mentioned earlier that we have seen the benefits of letting our teams communicate in their native language where possible. And one of the things we need to be aware of is where culture and language meet. As a native German speaker, for me, formal language versus informal language has always been a natural consideration. Calling somebody Sie in a formal context or Du has been something I had to navigate since I was a child. I remember having to push through some discomfort when this natural distinction was no longer available to me, when English became my main working language. On most of my projects, using the first name when conversing with clients is the norm, but it's not always used when responding to customers on social media channels, especially when we deal with negative issues or complaints where more formality can be called for. We need to adapt quite readily. Over the years, we have definitely developed an awareness that we need to have very open communication with our European clients and team members about navigating formality in language and how it affects our internal working relationships, but also the relationships we have with customers. Being too informal in our use of language might upset some people. In other situations, being more informal can help in building a relationship. I learned a lot when we started to cover Southeastern European markets on one of my projects. My Greek and Bulgarian team members explained to me how important it was for them to first build a relationship with their client contact by using more formal language. And once the relationship was established, a more informal tone could be adopted. When we started our work for the 19 countries and 17 languages, we had not considered that in much detail, but given all teams the same communication templates and guidance. We have learned from this, and today we work much more closely with our teams in getting language right, whether it's adapting the tone of voice we use to communicate with people on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, or the way we communicate with our business contacts. What we always aim to do when we work for pan-European clients is to share good practice between markets. And yet we had to learn sometimes the hard way that some areas can be easier to replicate across borders and languages than others. Translating humor across languages and cultures has probably been our biggest challenge. On one of my British consumer goods brands, we ran a very successful engagement campaign with a very cheeky and humorous approach. It was very British in tone of voice, and we discussed afterwards with our French and Dutch teams how we could actually explain to their client contacts how we had approached the campaign. We wanted to show why the engagement was so well received by customers and how we efficiently used play on words. And we wanted to replicate all of this in their countries. We went into those conversations with a lot of excitement, and we came out of them rather deflated. Our French team was convinced it was practically impossible to use this as a case study because it wouldn't work in the context of their culture and especially their language. All the little funny remarks that created opportunities to talk to people simply did not translate into French and had no French equivalents. This was both a sobering and an educational experience, and it is the kind of lesson you want to learn when you work across borders. For me, working in a pan-European environment is a wonderful, enriching experience. Every day feels a bit like going on a journey, navigating cultures, languages, and interacting with people from very diverse backgrounds. Many of the people I work with are no longer living in their country of origin, like me, because this kind of work often attracts professionals who have moved away for a variety of reasons. And this then adds yet another dimension of how our use of our native language can change when we are no longer fully immersed in it. It's a risk to manage, but it's also an opportunity. But that's a subject for another time. I live in a very remote and sparsely populated area of the UK. So for me, this truly European experience is immensely valuable for retaining my own cultural roots. I hope that I was able to give you a bit of insight into what my work is all about and what's rewarding and what's challenging. And I'm quite happy to answer any questions. And hello to everybody who joined after I started.